Trestdale School should have been forgotten. It stands at the far edge of Bethnal Green, past the railway line, beyond the rows of crumbling terraces where fog clings thick as wool. It has no place on tourist maps, no plaques, no fading blue signs to mark its history. Most of London has grown over its past, but not Trestdale. The school still stands, and nobody knows why. I first heard its name from a case file, one that had been buried deep within the archives, thick with dust and the brittle scent of old ink. Felix Durnell, our senior archivist, had tossed it onto my desk without ceremony. "Low priority retrieval," he said, sipping his tea. "Disappearance cases, strange history, nothing recent, but see if there's anything worth reporting. Good luck, Samuel." The folder was old. Too old. The kind of file that should have been lost to time, yet here it was, waiting. I spent the evening poring through my reports, my fingers tracing faded typewritten words, sifting through brittle newspaper clippings and yellowed attendance logs. The pattern emerged quickly. 1898, a school teacher disappears, several students go missing. And then, 1901, the headmaster locks himself in his office and is never seen again. When authorities break down the door, the room is empty, but his boots are neatly placed by the desk. 1942, an entire class is quietly removed from the school's record. No explanations given. Parents who attempt to file inquiries are met with silence. And then, 1977, the school is abruptly shut down following multiple reports of children claiming that during lessons they saw a second teacher standing at the blackboard. The teacher, of course, wasn't there. By the late 1980s, the building was abandoned, left to rot, yet something stopped the wrecking crew from tearing it down. I found a brief, unpublished article from a 1994 demolition attempt. "The planned site clearance of Trestdale Street School has been indefinitely postponed following an incident involving one of the workmen. No statement has been given by the foreman, but sources report that an unidentified worker entered the old headmaster's office and failed to return. The site was evacuated after his boots were found neatly placed by the door." It was the headmaster's office again, and the missing worker? They never found him. A name erased from history. And then I found something worse. Tucked inside the file was an old register, the ink smudged and barely legible. It listed names of students from 1898, but something was wrong. Several of the names had been blacked out. Entire sections were scrubbed from history. And in the margins, written in spidery ink, "Do not say her name." There was only one name that hadn't been erased, one teacher, Miss Eleanor Harker. There was no employment record for her, no prior history, no resignation, and no mention of what happened to her. Just a single final note in the school's ledger, dated November 3rd, 1898. No further lessons required. The wording felt strange, clinical, like an attempt to erase something. I turned back to the missing students. All of them were in our class. I checked the archives for anything. Birth records, census forms, even death certificates. But it was like she never had existed. The only trace of her was a scrap of paper, wedged inside an old school book at the bottom of the file. The ink had bled, but I could still read it. "She's still waiting. The lesson is never over." Of course, I should have stopped there, but the thing about working in the archives, it makes you curious. Too curious. the urban explorer. I might have ignored the case, filed it away like so many others, if not for what had happened last week. An urban explorer had been found inside Trestdale Street School, barely conscious, his hands covered in chalk dust. Doctors said he was in some kind of fugue state, unresponsive, but his fingers kept moving, twitching against their reel, twitching against the air, writing. When he woke, he couldn't remember anything past the first corridor, but his camera had recorded everything. I was granted access to the footage. I played it back, alone in the archives, in the dim glow of my desk lamp. At first, it was nothing. Just the usual grainy night vision shots, empty hallways, the crunch of broken glass underfoot, a few desks overturned. Then he entered a classroom. The blackboard was clean. But Jason's breath hitched. He turned the camera sharply, and there she was. A woman. Her back to him. Her dress was grey, old-fashioned and motionless, as though frozen in time. The chalk in her hand moved, scratching against the board in sharp, deliberate strokes, and then the footage cut out. Jason's last recorded words. "She's turning around." I rewound the tape, paused on the last frame, and there, just for a moment before the camera failed, a shadow too long for a person, something unfolding from the walls, something that was never human to begin with. I shut the laptop. I'd seen enough. Tomorrow, I was going inside, and Virgil was coming with me. In part 2, you're going to find out what exactly happened with myself and Virgil as we entered Trestdale, uncovering the blackboard secret and coming face to face with the entity itself. If you haven't already subscribed, liked and comment, please give one on the video to keep us pushing for more videos and more content to your lovely ears. So let's get back to the haunting of Trestdale Street School by me, Samuel, the junior archivist. Part 2, the investigation. I should have left it alone. Instead, I went to Trestdale. Virgil wasn't thrilled about it. "Cases like these don't go quiet for 40 years, he said, throwing a duffel bag into the boot of his car. "They wait." The bag was filled with salt, iron filings, protective charms, and a crowbar, a sign that Virgil expected this to go badly. "You really think we need all that?" I asked. Virgil gave me a long look. "You saw the footage." I didn't argue. Felix had insisted we check in every hour. Eliza Montgomery, our folklore specialist, had provided me with a list of protective sigils, and Edward Warrington, the Archives Global Affairs Officer, handed me a redacted document from 1943, stamped with the insignia of the Order of the Ashen Veil. It contained ritual instructions. They had tried to erase Miss Harker from existence. They failed. The last words in the report were, "She is part of the school now." We parked 2 streets away. The school loomed ahead, skeletal and hollow. From the outside it looked like any other abandoned ruin, ivy curling through the shattered windows, wooden boards over the doorways, bricks, blackened by time. But the silence was not right. London is never quiet. Even at night you hear the hum of traffic, the distant wail of sirens, the muffled voices from late night drinkers. But here, nothing. No wind, no birds, just dead, heavy air. Virgil gripped the crowbar. "Let's make this quick." As we entered the school, the first thing I noticed was the smell. Chalk dust, old wood, the faint trace of mildew. But beneath it all, something else, like paper burning without smoke. The floor was warped from damp, the ceiling caved in at certain points. We moved carefully, our flashlights slicing through the dark. The walls were lined with rotting display boards, cracked glass, and the photos inside had faded beyond recognition. Then I saw it. The headmaster's office. The door closed. Virgil held up a hand, signalling for me to wait. The door had been shut since 1977, since the last time someone had vanished inside. But I stepped closer. It creaked open on its own. Beyond it, the office was empty. But on the desk, covered in dust, was a single object. A pair of neatly placed boots were swallowed. They looked modern. Virgil exhaled sharply. "That's the missing workers." A shadow flickered in the corner of my vision. I spun, but nothing was there. Just the hallway, just the school waiting. "We should keep moving," I muttered. Virgil nodded. "Let's find this fucking blackboard." We reached the classroom from the footage. The door was ajar slightly. Virgil pushed it open, and the room inside was untouched, as if though frozen in time. Desks stood in perfect rows, dust coated but otherwise undisturbed. The air was heavy, pressing against my chest, and then my flashlight landed on the blackboard, and I felt my stomach drop. There were fresh words scrawled in the chalk, written in my own handwriting. A lesson, a name, Eleanor Harker. "Tell me you didn't write that." I shook my head, my throat dry. I've never been here before. But the letters were mine. I staggered back, heart hammering. That's when we heard it. Footsteps in the hallway, deliberate, unhurried, coming closer. Virgil grabbed the soul. "Shit, get ready." The room darkened. The shadows at the edges of the classroom stretched, swallowing in the corners. Then we saw her, standing in the doorway. It must have been her, Miss Eleanor Harker. She looked distorted. She wasn't even decayed, not even ghostly, just unfinished. Her dress hung motionless, her figure slightly blurred, like an image struggling to stay in focus. And her face, there was no face, just the suggestion of one, a shadow where the features should be, a smudge against reality. Virgil started muttering a curse, stepping forward with the salt. The chalk in her hand moved. She was writing again, on the blackboard. The chalk screeched, as if it carved fresh letters into the board. "We can't let her finish," Virgil said. I grabbed the cloth, my hand shaking, but before I could erase the word, she turned her head towards me, or rather, the shadow of her face turned. I felt the pull, a gravity behind the gaze, like my name was already written somewhere in a lesson plan. Virgil moved first. He threw the salt. The chalk burned. The words on the blackboard blackened and curled, smoke rising from the letters. Miss Harker staggered, her form flickering. The wall shook, desks scraped across the floor, pushed by an unseen hand, but she wasn't gone. She was turning again, and I understood. She wasn't just teaching, she was taking attendance, and we'd just been marked present. The only way we can stop this is to erase the lesson before it was finished. I lunged for the blackboard, scrubbing out the words. Miss Harker twitched, her body contorting as if the act of erasure was physically harming her. Her shadowy form flickered, becoming transparent. Virgil grabbed the ritual instructions from the 1943 document where the Order of the Ashen Veil had tried to previously erase her from history, but they had failed. They'd written something meant to contain her. Virgil started reciting the words aloud, and the air shivered. Mrs. Harker's form collapsed inwards, like ink being sucked into parchment. The blackboard cracked, splintering apart, and she was gone. The room was silent, but the chalk was still moving. One last message scrawling across the fractured board. Wait, the lesson isn't over yet. We left Trestdale School in silence, not out of relief, not because we thought it was over, but because we knew we had failed. The blackboard had cracked, the words had burnt, the classroom had shuddered and trembled as if reality itself had been disrupted. But as we turned to leave, the message had written itself. Wait, the lesson isn't over yet. Virgil was gripping the crowbar so tightly his knuckles had gone white. Neither of us spoke as we reached the car. We drove back to the archives as the street lights blurred past. I could feel it. Something has changed, and the case was far from closed. By the time we got back, it was nearly 2 a.m. The archives were quiet. The underground hall was resting in their eerie stillness. Felix was waiting for us, perched at his desk with a cup of tea and a knowing look in his eyes. "Back in one piece, I see." I dropped my bag on the table, my hand still shaking. "It's not over." Felix didn't look surprised. He just nodded towards the case file, now open in front of him. "I know." I frowned. What do you mean?" Felix tapped the edge of the file, his fingers landing on an old forgotten report, one I hadn't seen before. The page was yellow and fragile, the ink faded but still legible. It was a police interview transcript, taken in 1943, the same year the Order of the Ashen Veil had attempted to erase Miss Harker from existence. I leaned closer, my stomach twisting. The interviewee? One of the last students from 1898. The survivor's account. Felix cleared his throat and began to read aloud. Interview transcript, April 12, 1943. Interviewer: "Can you tell us what you remember about Miss Eleanor Harker?" Witness: Silence for 17 seconds. "I don't want to." Interviewer: "We need to know, we need to understand what happened." Witness, after a long pause: She was our teacher, but she wasn't. She was never meant to be there." The interviewer: "Explain." The witness: "She wasn't on the register at first. I remember there was another teacher, a real teacher, but one day she just wasn't there anymore, and Miss Harker was standing at the front of the class like she'd always been there." Interviewer: "Was she different?" "She didn't blink." "What happened to the missing students?" "She took them." Felix stopped reading. The room was too quiet. Felix stopped reading. The room was too quiet. I stared at the transcript, my breath shallow. "She took them," I repeated. Felix nodded. "And if this is right, they never came back." Virgil exhaled slowly, rubbing his hands over his face. "That means the disappearances weren't separate incidences. He gestured to the old records. "The students in 1898, the class erased from the book in 1942, the Workmen in 1977, and the demolition worker in 1994. It's all the same thing. Something dawning, something waking up every few decades. And as if the pattern was holding." Virgil grabbed the case file, flipping through the final entry, his jaw tensed. "Samuel?" I looked up. "What?" Virgil turned the file around, his finger pressing against the last confirmed disappearances of 1977. 47 years ago. And now we have an urban explorer found unresponsive. I understood instantly. It was happening again. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my office sifting through every record I could find. Felix had gone home. Virgil had stayed in the building, but the door was shut. The only sound was the faint humming of old lamps, the rustle of papers underhand, and then there was a noise. Soft, like chalk against slate. I froze. The sound came again, slow, deliberate, scratching. I turned my head, and across the room, the whiteboard had changed. I had written notes earlier, but now the words were different. The phrase had been rewritten in chalk. The lesson is never old. My stomach turned cold. I wasn't alone. The shadow moved at the edge of the room. I spun around, heart hammering. Nothing there. I swore. For the fraction of a second, I swore I saw something standing in the doorway, watching, waiting. The next morning, I gathered everyone. Felix, Virgil, Edward, Eliza. We laid everything out. Every report, every disappearance, every scrap of information we had on Miss Harker. And then we started piecing it together. Edward leaned back on his chair, rubbing his temple. "We know it's not a traditional haunting." Felix nodded. "And we know it's not a poltergeist or residual echo. It's persistent, intelligent." Eliza tapped her finger against the Latin phrase in the 1943 Order of the Ashen Veil report. "Impressio, cognitio, persistence." I frowned. What does that mean? Felix sighed. "It roughly translates to persistent cognitive imprint." She's not a ghost, I whispered. Eliza nodded grimly. She's an idea, a lesson that repeats itself. Felix picked up his pen and turned to the official classification ledger. He hesitated, then in clear, precise strokes he wrote, Case Trestdale 77. Entry classification Class 5, persistent cognitive imprint. Eliza folded her arms. If that's correct, that means... I finished her sentence. It means, is she still active? Felix set his pen down. And she always will be. Silence settled between us. The case was closed but not resolved. That night I dreamed of Trestdale. I was back in the classroom. The desks were filled with silent children, their faces blurred and indistinct. And at the front of the classroom, Miss Harker. The chalk moved, smooth and effortless, as she wrote the same message again and again. The message, the lesson is never over. And then slowly she turned, and this time she had a face. She smiled, and in her voice, soft, patient, endless, she spoke my name. I woke in a cold sweat. The archives were dark, the overhead lamps long since powered down for the night, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. The dream. Was it a dream? Still clung to me. The classroom, the children sitting at their desks, unmoving, and her. She'd spoken my name, Miss Harker, and that meant something had changed. I needed answers. I scrambled out of bed, hands shaking as I flipped through the old reports again. The Order of the Ashen Veil's failed containment ritual, the vanished students, the erased records. Eliza's words rang in my head. She's not a ghost, she's an idea. A persistent cognitive imprint, which meant 1, she doesn't just haunt a place, she haunts a concept. 2, she cannot be exorcised because she's not alive. And 3, she spreads by memory. The last realization hit me like a punch to the gut. She'd spoken my name in the dream. That meant she knew I knew about her, and that meant I was now part of the lesson. I ran to Felix's office, barely pausing to knock. He was already awake, poring over some files I'd been obsessing over. He glanced up at me. You saw her, didn't you? I nodded, throat tight. She said my name. Felix set his pen down. Then we're running out of time. Virgil and Edward arrived a few minutes later. Eliza joined us holding an old book of forgotten folklore, one she'd been cross-referencing with the Trestdale case. We've been thinking about this the wrong way, she said, dropping the book onto the table with a heavy thud. Every attempt to erase Miss Harker has failed. The Order of the Ashen Veil tried in 1943 and the school's demolition was halted twice. Why? Edward crossed his arms. Because she isn't tied to the building. She's tied to the idea of her class. Exactly. Eliza tapped the book, and ideas can't be destroyed, but they can be rewritten. I blinked. What are you saying? Felix leaned forward, already catching on. She needs the lesson to continue. That's why the disappearances are tied to the circles of teaching, 1898, 1942, and 1977. He exhaled. If we want to stop this, we need to change the lesson. Virgil frowned. You're suggesting we go back? Felix nodded. Yes. Edward rubbed his temples. This is a bad idea. It's the only idea, I muttered. So we returned to Trestdale just before dawn. The fog was thicker than before, curling around the ruined walls like fingers. None of us spoke as we stepped inside. The school felt different now. The silence was expectant, as if it knew we had returned. Virgil and Edward spread salt along the doorways. Eliza pulled out a stack of blank chalkboards, a last-minute idea from the archive storage room. And me? I stood in front of the original blackboard, staring at the faint outline of the last word she had written. The lesson is never over. Felix handed me some pieces of chalk. Rewrite it, he murmured. My hands shook, but I wrote, class dismissed. The moment the words formed, the air shifted. The room darkened as if the sun itself had been swallowed, and then we heard her, a slow, deliberate click of heels against the wooden floor. She was coming. Virgil drew his iron blade. Eliza whispered an incantation under her breath. I gripped the chalk tighter, forcing myself to keep going. The blackboard shuddered, the surface rippling like water, and then the shadow stretched across the room. Mrs. Harker was here, but she was different now. No longer flickering, no longer unfinished. She was complete. Her face fully formed, and she was angry. The Battle of Trestdale. She lunged. The classroom shattered, desks splintered, chalkboards cracked, and the air hummed with an unnatural electric charge. Virgil swung the iron, but it passed through her like smoke. Edward threw salt. It hissed in the air, but Mrs. Harker didn't vanish, because she no longer was bound to the school. She was bound to me, because I'd seen her, because I'd spoken her name, and then... The blackboard glowed. A new message etched itself onto the slate, but this time it wasn't hers, it was mine. Lesson is complete. The school shook. The walls buckled inward as if being sucked into a void. Mrs. Harker stopped, but for the first time she hesitated, because the lesson had changed. I turned to the others. Now! Eliza snapped her fingers, activated the sigils she had drawn around the room. Virgil drove the iron into the floorboards. Edward threw the last of the salt into the air, and Felix whispered, "Be gone!" Mrs. Harker let out a single echoing cry. The blackboard collapsed inwards, and the writing disappeared in an instant. And then, silence. Mrs. Harker was gone. The school was empty, and for the first time in over a century, Trestdale Street School was silent. Back at the archives, Felix wrote the final entry in the case file. Case Trestdale 77. Final classification, Class 5 persistent cognitive imprint. Neutralized. But was it truly neutralized? We wasn't sure, because ideas don't die, they change. But somewhere buried in my mind I could still hear a voice, soft and patient. The lesson is never over. 3 days after we settled the case, I woke up to find something written on my bathroom mirror. It was in chalk, and it was in my handwriting. Just 2 words. Class dismissed. And beneath it, a single, perfectly drawn apple. Waiting. For now, that's the end of the case. But as we always say, history repeats itself, and some lessons are never truly over. The end.